Have you ever wondered what happens when the line between portraying a character and living it becomes so blurred that it vanishes? When the actor's mask merges with his own face, and you no longer know where fiction ends and reality begins. That is exactly what happened to Jim Caviezel. It wasn't just another role in his career. It was a calling that turned his life completely upside down. As you read these words, comfortably seated, take a moment to consider. What if every choice we make opened doors to dimensions we cannot see? And what if there were spiritual consequences to our mundane decisions? The sky over the film's set was heavy that morning. Jim watched the clouds moving at an unusual speed, as if a silent omen hung over everyone present. He had no idea that this would only be the first sign. "I think I'm ready," he told the director, adjusting the artificial crown of thorns. But was he really? Would you be ready to carry the weight of the divine, even if only in fiction? The temperature dropped dramatically as the cameras began to roll. The technicians blamed the central air system, but Jim felt something different. It was as if an ancient, watchful presence had just entered the studio, scrutinizing his every move with microscopic precision. Can you imagine the burden of representing the sacred? Of embodying the most revered figure in Western history, while millions of spiritual eyes turn their attention to you? "Cut!" the director shouted after the first scene. "Perfect, Jim. There's something different about you today." Yes, there was indeed something different. Something had changed the moment he accepted the role. It was as though a window had been opened in his spirit, allowing invisible currents to flow in and out at will. That night, alone in his trailer, Jim experienced for the first time a chill that didn't come from the air conditioner. And it was then that he began to hear the whispers. The whispers started like a nocturnal breeze, almost imperceptible, easily mistaken for the rustling of leaves or the distant hum of equipment. But you know how it is when something doesn't sound natural, even if you can't quite explain why. It's just exhaustion, Jim kept telling himself, massaging his temples. Yet the feeling persisted. With every scene shot, with every moment he delved deeper into the role of Christ, the whispers became clearer, more articulated. Words and languages he had never studied began to make sense. Have you ever felt that you are being tested beyond your limits? That there is something greater at stake than your personal comfort? On the third day of filming, the first physical incident occurred. The crew attributed it to an accident. Naturally, accidents happen on film sets all the time. But when lightning struck the cross during a shot, exactly at the moment Jim uttered, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" Even the most skeptical felt a shiver run down their spine. "It was just a meteorological coincidence," explained the director of photography, avoiding Jim's gaze. Coincidence, the word we use to explain the inexplicable, to give a name to what we refuse to see clearly. In the following weeks, Jim began noticing strange patterns. Objects would change places when no one was looking. Lights flickered without any apparent reason during his dialogue rehearsals. In his hotel room, the temperature fluctuated drastically without explanation. And then came the dreams. Have you ever had a dream so vivid that, upon waking, you couldn't tell whether it had been real or imagined? Now imagine that boundary dissolving completely. Jim spent his nights in ancient landscapes, conversing with figures clad in period attire, feeling the heat of the Judean desert on his skin, as if he were really there. He would wake up exhausted, with knowledge he hadn't possessed before falling asleep. "You're different," remarked a fellow actor. "Your eyes, they seem to see right through people now." What no one knew was that Jim was beginning to see beyond the veil of the ordinary. The layers of the common world grew translucent, revealing movements of energies invisible to ordinary eyes. "Do you believe in spiritual warfare?" he asked his agent during a tense phone call. The silence on the other end was more revealing than any answer. There comes a moment in every person's life when they must decide to continue pretending that they do not see the extraordinary unfolding around them, or to accept that reality is far more vast and complex than we have been taught. For Jim, that moment arrived halfway through filming. While the makeup artists were touching up the artificial wounds on his body, he saw, for the first time in complete clarity, shadows moving along the studio walls. These were not ordinary shadows, cast by objects under the lights. They had intention. They were conscious. Have you ever felt that you were being watched by something you couldn't clearly see? That primitive feeling which awakens our deepest survival instincts. "Are you okay?" asked the makeup artist, noticing his sudden pallor. "I'm fine," he replied automatically, while his eyes followed the sinuous movements along the walls. "Just tired." Tired. That word hardly captured what he felt. It was an exhaustion that reached beyond the physical, as if something was feeding on his vital energy, on his very essence. That very night, in his hotel room, Jim decided to do something he hadn't done seriously since childhood. He knelt and prayed. It wasn't a formal or rote prayer. It was a silent cry for help, for understanding. And then it happened. The sensation began subtly. A tingling in the fingertips that gradually spread throughout his body. The air around him seemed to grow denser, as if oxygen itself had become weighty. The shadows in the corners of the room receded, as though repelled by an unseen light. "Who's there?" he whispered, even though he knew it wasn't a human presence. And for the first time, the whispers that had tormented him for weeks responded with absolute clarity. "You have chosen to represent the light. Now you shall know the darkness that seeks to extinguish it." Can you imagine what it is like to receive such a message? To feel that, in some inexplicable way, you have become a battleground for forces that surpass your understanding? The next morning, the director noticed something different in his performance. "It's as if you underwent a transformation overnight," he commented. "There's an authenticity in your suffering that wasn't there yesterday." Jim simply nodded. How can one explain that the pain he portrayed in front of the cameras had become real on a level that transcended the physical? As filming progressed, the inexplicable incidents multiplied. Electronic equipment failed whenever Jim was near. Animals used in the scenes reacted unpredictably to his presence, sometimes showing a reverential fear, other times a contained aggression. And then came the storm, both literal and metaphorical. The storm arrived without warning, defying every meteorological prediction. It was as if the sky itself had decided to manifest during the filming of the crucifixion. Have you ever been at the eye of a storm? That paradoxical moment of absolute calm while chaos whirls around you. That is exactly how Jim felt, suspended on the set's cross, as lightning tore across the horizon. "Should we stop?" shouted a production assistant, struggling against the wind that threatened to knock over the equipment. "Keep rolling," ordered the director, hypnotized by the intensity of the moment. The cameras are capturing something extraordinary. And indeed they were. What would later appear in the footage defied technical explanation. Halos of inexplicable light around Jim's figure, strange patterns in the clouds, and the most disturbing of all, humanoid-shaped shadows that did not belong to any member of the crew. As the rain drenched his body, Jim entered an altered state of consciousness. The boundary between him and the character he portrayed dissolved completely. The words he spoke were not in the script. They flowed through him in a language he had never studied. Yet everyone present recognized it as ancient Aramaic. "What is happening to you?" the director asked when they finally halted the filming hours later. Jim looked at him with eyes that seemed to have witnessed millennia. "It isn't what is happening to me," he replied in a calm voice. "It is what is happening all around us." That night, alone in his room, he finally understood. He wasn't merely playing a part. He had become a conduit, a channel between dimensions that ordinarily do not intersect. Do you believe that there are invisible portals all around us? Passages between the mundane and the transcendent that, from time to time, open for those with eyes willing to see. The spiritual attacks intensified after that day. They were no longer just whispers or sensations. They became physical manifestations impossible to ignore. Objects flew through the rooms. Temperatures plummeted without explanation. Unaccountable marks appeared on his body, similar to the wounds that makeup artists created daily, but which now emerged spontaneously during the night. "You need help," his agent insisted over the phone. "Medical, psychological, whatever help you can get." But Jim knew that no doctor or psychologist could treat what he was facing. This was beyond the reach of modern science. It was a battle taking place on a plane that most human beings go through their entire lives without ever noticing. It was then that he sought out a different kind of counselor, a man whom the production had originally hired merely as a historical consultant, but whom Jim later discovered was also a scholar of spiritual phenomena. "What is happening to me?" Jim asked after recounting his experiences. The elderly man watched him for a long moment before responding. "You have lifted the veil." "What veil?" "The veil that separates the visible from the invisible, the physical from the spiritual. By accepting to portray a figure of such tremendous spiritual magnitude, you inadvertently became a participant in a war that has been waged since the dawn of time." "A war?" Jim repeated, feeling the weight of those words. The old man nodded, his eyes reflecting a wisdom that seemed to transcend his own existence. "A war for the human soul, for free will, for the very nature of reality. Have you ever considered that perhaps there are layers of reality operating simultaneously around you? Dimensions that we normally do not perceive, but that occasionally seep into our everyday experience?" "Why me?" Jim whispered. "Why not you?" The elder replied with a smile. "Sometimes we do not choose the battlefield. The battlefield chooses us." In the weeks that followed, as filming was drawing to a close, Jim learned to navigate this new reality. He was no longer just an actor portraying Christ. He had become a warrior in an invisible battle. The consultant taught him ancient techniques of spiritual protection, specific prayers that acted as shields, visualization methods that strengthened his energetic boundaries. Above all, he learned to discern between the voices he heard, identifying which sought to confuse him and which offered genuine guidance. "It's like learning a new language," the elder explained. "The language of the spirit. With practice, you begin to recognize the dialects of good and evil." Yet even with these new tools, the attacks continued. It was as if, by strengthening his defenses, he had become an even more valuable target. Have you ever felt that the closer you get to your inner truth, the more obstacles arise in your path, as if the universe were testing your determination before unveiling its deepest secrets? One night, exhausted after an especially intense day of filming, Jim fell into a deep sleep. The dream he had was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't a confusing or symbolic narrative, but a crystalline vision. He saw himself on a vast, ethereal battlefield. Luminous and shadowy figures clashed in silent combat. Looking down, he noticed that his body emitted a soft glow, as if illuminated from within. A figure approached, majestic, radiant, impossible to look at directly. "Do you understand now?" asked the figure, with a voice that seemed composed of 1,000 voices in perfect harmony. "Not completely," Jim replied honestly. "You were not attacked because you failed," explained the presence. "You were attacked because you succeeded, because every true word spoken, every authentic emotion expressed through you, created ripples that resonated beyond the physical plane." Upon awakening, Jim felt a clarity he hadn't experienced since the beginning of his journey. The attacks were not a punishment, they were a confirmation. Confirmation that something truly significant was taking place through him. On the final day of filming, when he finally uttered "it is finished," a reverent silence fell over the entire set. It wasn't just the end of a scene or even a film. It was the culmination of a personal transformation that had completely redefined his understanding of reality. And as the camera ceased rolling, Jim realized that the whispers had also stopped. The shadows in the corners had receded. The battle, at least that phase of it, was over. But something remained. Years passed since the filming ended. The film was released, sparked controversy, and touched millions around the world. Jim continued his career, accepted other roles, and lived his life. But nothing was ever the same. Have you ever undergone an experience so transformative that it divided your life into before and after? As if you had crossed an invisible threshold that made it impossible to return to the person you once were. In interviews, Jim spoke cautiously about his experiences during the filming. "I suffered spiritual attacks," he confessed, choosing his words carefully, knowing that for many it might sound like exaggeration or superstition. What he did not reveal in detail was how those attacks, paradoxically, had strengthened his faith, how the direct confrontation with forces that sought to silence him confirmed, more than anything else, the reality of what he was representing. "People ask me if I regret it," he confided to an interviewer. "How could I regret something that showed me the truth?" The truth, a simple word to describe a complex revelation, the understanding that there is a subtle veil separating the world we see from the world we do not, and that occasionally, that veil opens for those who, whether knowingly or not, stand on the threshold between these worlds. Have you ever considered that perhaps your own life is part of a greater narrative? That your daily struggles, your trials, your moments of doubt and faith are microcosms of a larger battle? Today, Jim bears the invisible scars of that experience. They are not open wounds as before. They have transformed into silent reminders that reality is vaster, more mysterious, and more intentional than most of us perceive day to day. He has learned to recognize the subtle signs of that other dimension operating around him, not only in dramatic moments, but in the quiet routine of everyday life. An unexpected shiver, a feeling of being watched when he is alone, a thought that seems to come from somewhere outside himself. The greatest mistake, he says when asked about his experience, is to believe that we are alone, that our actions have no consequences beyond what is immediately visible, that our choices do not echo through dimensions we can scarcely imagine. On silent nights, when the line between wakefulness and sleep grows thin, Jim sometimes still hears the whispers, not threatening or confusing anymore, but as reminders of a truth that few are privileged to witness firsthand. And for you, who has made it to the end of this narrative, perhaps there is a question worth considering. If the veil were to open in your own life, even if just for a brief moment, would you have the courage to look? To accept that perhaps, just perhaps, your daily struggles, your personal challenges, your quiet victories are more significant than you ever imagined? Perhaps, at this very moment, while your eyes scan these words, something is watching you, not with malice or threat, but with the same curiosity with which we observe a traveler who finally begins to perceive the true nature of the journey. Jim Caviezel did not choose to see beyond the veil. That vision was granted to him, or imposed upon him, depending on one's perspective, by extraordinary circumstances. Yet all of us, in moments of utter stillness, can sense the pulse of that other reality. The question is not whether it exists. The question is whether we are prepared to recognize it.